is at the courthouse in Manhattan alongside CBS News national correspondent Jerika Duncan. Errol, Jerika, great to have you.
Hey, Lilia, that's right. Jerika is here with me, but let me give you a quick summary on that penalty that Judge Ron Merchant ordered to Donald Trump. $9,000 for 9 violations of the gag order and a warning that any continued violations would end up with some type of incarceration for Trump. And Thursday, the judge will hold a hearing on 4 additional gag order violations that the prosecution says he has made. So a significant morning already. CBS Weekend News anchor and national correspondent Jerika Duncan, you've been inside the courthouse. You were close to the former president this morning as he was making remarks. What jumped out at you?
You know, it was very typical of what he had to say about this process being flawed. He called for the judge to recuse himself today, in fact, saying that legal scholars feel...
Hello and welcome, guys. Adam is here. What just happened, guys, is massive. Trump sat in silence before the Supreme Court, unable to tweet, unable to fire anyone, unable to bulldoze his way through, while the justices he believed he'd conquered methodically dismantled his claims to executive power and asked him plainly, "What exactly makes you think you're above the law?" This wasn't a quiet procedural hearing tucked away in some basement courtroom where nobody was paying attention. This was the big stage, the highest court in the land, the one place where there is no audience to play to, no cable news hits to spin the narrative, and no escape hatch when the questions get uncomfortable.
As though this case merits no real warrant or is going to be effective. So more of the same, but again, he's talked for about 6 or 7 minutes just talking about how everything is a sham, it's a hoax, and that what we're hearing is not true.
It's interesting also because we have not heard from Donald Trump is specific criticisms of witnesses and specific criticisms of the judge. He's now being hit with these penalties. But meantime, the jury is hearing the prosecution's case effectively be proven through testimony. We had David Pecker last week, former publisher of the National Enquirer. We had people who were related to the key women who were paid off according to these alleged hush money payments.
Correct.
What did we hear today and what case is being made?
So we're hearing from what legal experts are calling sort of custodians of record. They brought in someone who takes video for C-SPAN and records everything. But what I thought was interesting is you heard Donald Trump's own words in some of the video where he said that he didn't know these women.
Trump was physically present in that chamber, his body planted in a seat just feet away from the 9 justices who hold his fate in their hands. And according to multiple eyewitness accounts from inside the room, the atmosphere was suffocating. You could cut the tension with a knife as justice after justice took turns eviscerating the legal foundation of his signature economic policy. We are talking about the global tariffs that Trump imposed using what he calls emergency powers, a sprawling system of taxes on imported goods that has collected a staggering $90 billion from American businesses. Billion with a B. And in that courtroom, the justices were not remotely impressed with the legal acrobatics his lawyers were attempting to justify this power grab.
That this was not true. He didn't know anything about them. But then, of course, just moments ago, they broke for lunch. But we heard from Keith Davidson, who's the attorney for Stephanie Clifford, a.k.a. Stormy Daniels, and Karen McDougal. He said that in reference to Karen McDougal, she, quote, had 3 goals: to rejuvenate her career, make money, and avoid becoming the scarlet letter, quote, the other woman. Now, she went public and talked about her alleged affair with Donald Trump that went on for about 10 months. And then, of course, we know at the heart of this case is Stormy Daniels, who received that $130,000, what we call hush money payment. Of course, the question is, was this with an intent to try and sway the election? What was very interesting, though, is that C-SPAN clip. And one of those clips, you hear Donald Trump say, if 5 or 10% of people think it's true, we won't win. So you're hearing jurors, even though you didn't hear from the president, he hasn't taken the stand, and we don't know if he will, you're hearing him in his own words talk about when all of this stuff was coming up about his connection to a Stormy Daniels, to Karen McDougal, say.
The centerpiece of this constitutional drama is a law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. On paper, it sounds reasonable enough. If the nation faces a genuine emergency, something like a foreign attack or an imminent threat that requires immediate action, the president needs the flexibility to respond without waiting 6 months for Congress to debate and deliberate. That makes perfect sense. Nobody wants the commander-in-chief to be paralyzed by bureaucracy when missiles are flying, but Trump took that narrow, crisis-focused authority and stretched it beyond recognition. He declared that routine trade deficits and what he calls unfair foreign competition constituted a national emergency severe enough to justify slapping taxes on virtually every trading partner on Earth. China, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, the entire global marketplace got hit with these tariffs, and the whole thing was done by the stroke of a presidential pen. No vote in the House, no debate in the Senate, no input from the legislative branch whatsoever.
This is not true.
That's right.
And he sat pretty stoically in the courtroom. His son is there. As you see Eric Trump, who was in the background when he did speak, and we were able to have the cameras on him. But you see him sitting there, not a lot of emotion, and you can't say anything. So he's forced to sit there and listen.
And we hadn't seen any of Trump's relatives in the courtroom up until today.
Correct.
And Lilia, what's noteworthy too is here outside the courtroom, this is likely the most quiet it's been all day. There's been a few dozen pro-Trump supporters full with Trump trucks driving behind us, which we hadn't seen last week either. And so, as we've mentioned before, the courtroom is the campaign trail for Donald Trump. So despite him keeping a tight lip inside the courtroom, the prosecution trying to use his own words against him, he has said he might testify. The judge has kind of created contours for what that testimony can and cannot include, what the
Congress was effectively told to sit down and shut up while the executive branch rewrote trade policy for the entire country. The states pushed back hard. A coalition led by Oregon, of all places, dragged this fight all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that the president had crossed every conceivable constitutional boundary. Their argument is straightforward and deeply rooted in the founding documents of this country. The power to tax belongs to Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution places the purse strings firmly in the hands of the legislature.
Prosecution can and cannot ask him. Go ahead.
And to your point, when you talked about those 9 contempt charges where he has to pay $9,000, prosecution asked for another hearing, the Sandoval hearing, to say, wait a minute, if he does testify, can we also ask him about these 9 violations? So that's something that has yet to be worked out.
Be a part of the mix. And
correct.
If you're the jury listening to this, they defer to judges. They defer, they have to spend time out of their lives to be here as well. They take this very seriously. So when any defendant gets hit with a contempt charge or is proven to be outside the lines of what the courtroom is doing, it doesn't end up working for them in the end. So some interesting developments from the courthouse today.
Thank you both.
And we'll have more tonight on the evening news.
Oh,
That's
excellent.
right. We'll be on the evening news with more tonight.
Well, we will be watching. Errol Barnett, Jerika Duncan, thank you so much.
That isn't some obscure legal footnote. That is the beating heart of representative government. The founders fought a revolutionary war to escape a monarchy where one person could impose financial burdens on the people by decree. They designed a system specifically to prevent an American president from ever having that kind of unilateral taxing authority. And yet here we are, with Trump's legal team standing before the highest court in the land, trying to convince the justices that trade deficits are such an urgent crisis that the normal constitutional order can simply be suspended. The most devastating moments of the hearing came from the justices Trump himself appointed. This is the detail that makes the entire saga so uniquely humiliating for him. Trump has spent years bragging about reshaping the judiciary, about putting conservative warriors on the bench who would defend his vision of executive power. He personally selected 3 of the 9 justices sitting on that elevated platform, and those 3 were not giving him a free pass. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the most scrutinized appointees in recent history, came out swinging with questions that revealed just how poorly the administration had thought through the practical consequences of their own arguments. She wanted to know about the money. What happens to the $90 billion that businesses have already paid if the court rules these tariffs are illegal? Do those payments get refunded? How exactly would that process work? What chaos would unfold as the government tries to unwind a revenue stream that has been flowing for months? The implications of her questions were devastating because they exposed that Trump's team had no exit strategy, no plan B, no idea what happens when the legal house of cards collapses. Chief Justice John Roberts, a Republican appointee who has spent his career trying to protect the institutional legitimacy of the court, was equally pointed in his interrogation. He zeroed in on the fundamental mechanism of what tariffs actually are. They are taxes. When the government imposes a tariff on imported goods, American companies pay that fee at the border, and those companies pass the cost directly to American consumers through higher prices. So what Trump has essentially done, and what Roberts was highlighting, is impose a massive new tax on the American people without a single vote in Congress. The Chief Justice framed this as a direct assault on the legislative branch's most essential power. The mechanism involves taxing Americans, he noted with surgical precision, which has always been Congress's fundamental power. That is not a friendly softball question from an ally. That is a warning shot fired across the bow of the entire executive branch, a signal that the court is deeply uncomfortable with the precedent being set here. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the more liberal voices on the bench and a frequent antagonist of this administration, took the questioning to an even more philosophical level. She started probing the boundaries of the emergency powers doctrine, asking Trump's lawyer to define where the limits actually are. If the president can declare a trade deficit an emergency and impose tariffs unilaterally, what stops a future president from declaring climate change a national emergency and imposing carbon taxes by decree? What stops a president from declaring healthcare costs a national emergency and regulating hospital prices without Congress? What about gun violence, housing crises, income inequality? Once you open the door to this kind of executive action, where exactly is the off-ramp? The lawyer for the administration stood at the podium, visibly struggling, stammering through answers that failed to draw any clear line. He tried to argue that the action had to be related to the specific emergency, but could not explain who gets to define that relationship other than the president who declared the emergency in the first place. It was circular logic on full display, and the justices were not buying it. The dynamics inside the chamber were reportedly electric. Justices were interrupting each other, which is unusual in the normally rigid protocols of the Supreme Court. Lawyers were getting cut off mid-sentence as the questions piled up faster than they could respond. And through all of it, Donald Trump sat there, physically present, legally powerless, forced to absorb every single blow without being able to fire back. This is a man who has built his entire political identity on the ability to counterpunch, to dominate the news cycle, to reframe any attack as a conspiracy against him. But in the Supreme Court, none of those tools work. You cannot tweet your way out of a tough question. You cannot hold a rally to intimidate a justice. You cannot appeal to the crowd when there is no crowd. You just have to sit there, in that wooden chair, and watch the entire legal justification for your signature policy get shredded in real time. And by all accounts, Trump was not handling it well. Observers described his face shifting through shades of red, his jaw tightening with every critical remark, his body language radiating a fury that he could not verbally express. The cage of judicial decorum was rattling, and the man inside was losing his composure. Before this hearing even began, Trump knew he was in trouble. The night before the arguments, he took to his social media platform and did what he always does when he senses defeat coming. He tried to change the narrative through sheer volume and apocalyptic rhetoric. He posted in all capital letters that this case was literally life or death for our country. Not important, not significant, not even critical. Life or death. That is the language of someone who recognizes that the ground is shifting beneath his feet and is desperate to frame the stakes so high that any ruling against him becomes an existential betrayal rather than a legal analysis. It is also a tell, an admission that deep down he understands the legal weaknesses of his position and is already preparing his supporters to see a loss as something more sinister than a simple disagreement over constitutional interpretation. The presence of Maryland Representative Jamie Raskin added another layer of political electricity to the moment. Raskin has been a relentless thorn in Trump's side for years, a constitutional law professor turned congressman who has made a career out of dissecting the legal overreach of this administration. Standing outside the court after the hearing, Raskin delivered the soundbite that perfectly encapsulates why this case matters so much beyond the immediate fate of these particular tariffs. No other president has ever attempted this before. That sentence is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. Not Barack Obama, who faced relentless obstruction from Congress. Not George W. Bush, who pushed executive power to its limits in the context of actual wars. Not Bill Clinton, not Ronald Reagan, not Franklin Roosevelt, who governed through the Great Depression and World War II. No previous occupant of the Oval Office has ever looked at the emergency powers statutes and concluded that they authorized a complete bypass of Congress on taxation and trade policy. Trump is in uncharted waters, and the Supreme Court knows it. The economic consequences of this case are staggering to contemplate. $90 billion is not an abstract figure that only matters to economists and policy wonks. That is real money extracted from real businesses that make real decisions about hiring and investment and pricing. Manufacturing companies that rely on imported components saw their costs skyrocket overnight when these tariffs hit. Retailers who source products from overseas had to either absorb massive losses or pass price increases to their customers. Small businesses, the ones without the cash reserves to weather political uncertainty, got hammered the hardest. And now all of those entities are trapped in a state of complete limbo, unsure whether they should be planning for a future where these costs are permanent or preparing to navigate the administrative nightmare of receiving refunds. Justice Barrett's line of questioning revealed that the administration had essentially no plan for this scenario. They had not thought through the mechanics of unwinding a $90 billion revenue stream because they never seriously believed they would have to. The hubris of that assumption is now on full display before the very court that could force them to do exactly that. The political calendar makes this moment even more perilous for Trump. The 2026 midterm elections are looming on the horizon, and the timing of the court's eventual decision will land right in the middle of the campaign season. A ruling that strikes down the tariffs would hand Democrats a gift-wrapped narrative about executive overreach, about a president who thought he was above the law, about the dangers of concentrated power. Every Republican candidate would be forced to answer uncomfortable questions about whether they support Trump's interpretation of presidential power or whether they believe in the constitutional limits their party has traditionally championed. The ads practically write themselves. A Supreme Court with 3 Trump appointees ruled that the president went too far, that he abused his authority, that he cannot be trusted with the powers he claims. That is the kind of messaging that moves swing voters and energizes opposition turnout. Trump knows this, which is why he is already trying to pre-spin a loss as the work of a corrupt system rather than the result of his own legal overreach. The broader constitutional implications are what should truly keep every American up at night, regardless of which political party they belong to. This case is not really about Donald Trump, even though his name is on the caption and his personal reaction is driving the news coverage. This case is about the presidency as an institution, about what happens to the separation of powers when one branch decides it no longer needs to respect the authority of the others. If the Supreme Court upholds Trump's use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs, they will be writing a blueprint that every future president can follow. A Democratic president could declare climate change a national emergency and impose carbon taxes without Congress. A Republican president could declare immigration a national emergency and fund a border wall by taxing remittances. A future populist of either party could declare income inequality a national emergency and regulate corporate pricing without ever consulting the legislature. The power, once granted, does not come with a partisan filter. It sits in the Oval Office waiting for whoever occupies it next. The conservative justices seem acutely aware of this dynamic. Their questions betrayed a discomfort that goes beyond the specific facts of this case. They were thinking about precedent, about the long game, about what happens when the shoe is on the other foot and a president they did not appoint is wielding the powers they are being asked to validate. Justice Barrett's practical concerns about refunds and administrative chaos showed a mind grappling with the real-world consequences of legal conclusions. Chief Justice Roberts' focus on the constitutional primacy of congressional taxing power reflected a career-long project of defending the court's role as a check on the other branches, not a rubber stamp for either party. Even the justices most sympathetic to executive power seemed to be searching for a limiting principle, some way to rule for Trump on this specific case without blowing the doors off the constitutional barn. The problem, as the oral arguments made painfully clear, is that the administration's lawyers could not provide one. The scene outside the courthouse after the hearing was a circus of political theater. Trump emerged from the building and immediately approached the waiting cameras, but this was not the triumphant press conference of a leader who just scored a knockout. This was the defensive, finger-pointing rant of a man who knows he is in deep trouble. He started railing against the court, complaining that the justices did not understand what was at stake, suggesting that the entire process was rigged against him. The talking points were familiar to anyone who has followed his career, but the venue made them dangerous. Attacking a district court judge appointed by the opposing party is one thing. Attacking the Supreme Court, packed with 3 of his own appointees and a conservative majority, is an entirely different level of escalation. It signals desperation. It signals recognition that the legal arguments are not breaking his way. And it raises the stakes of the eventual ruling to a fever pitch because if the court does rule against him, the aftermath will be a political explosion unlike anything we have seen since the disputed elections of previous eras. The coalition of states that brought this lawsuit deserves more attention than they have received. Oregon taking the lead is an interesting twist because it is not a state typically associated with being at the center of constitutional warfare, but their attorney general saw the tariffs as an existential threat to the state's economy, which depends heavily on international trade and the free flow of goods. They were joined by a diverse array of other states, creating a bipartisan or at least nonpartisan coalition that framed the issue not as a Republican versus Democrat fight, but as a constitutional principle that transcends party affiliation. The states argued that their own sovereignty was being trampled, that Congress had been rendered irrelevant on trade policy, and that the economic damage to their citizens required judicial intervention. The Supreme Court apparently agreed that these questions were serious enough to warrant their attention, accepting the case and scheduling oral arguments on an expedited basis. The human dimension of this economic uncertainty gets lost in the legal jargon and political analysis, but it deserves to be centered. Every day that passes without a ruling is another day that business owners wake up not knowing what their cost structure will look like 6 months from now. It is another day that consumers pay elevated prices, not because the underlying economics demand it, but because a legal fight over presidential power has not been resolved. It is another day that workers wonder whether their employers' profit margins can withstand the sustained pressure of these tariffs or whether layoffs are coming. The arrogance of imposing this chaos by executive fiat without legislative debate, without public hearings, without any of the democratic processes that are supposed to accompany decisions of this magnitude is precisely what the Constitution was designed to prevent. And the Supreme Court, regardless of its ideological composition, seems to recognize that the system is being tested in a way it has never been tested before. Looking forward, the timeline for a decision extends into the spring or early summer. The justices will retreat to their chambers, review the briefs, circulate draft opinions, argue among themselves, and eventually produce a ruling that will define this era of constitutional law. The waiting period will be agonizing for everyone with a stake in the outcome, which is essentially everyone in the country. The tariffs remain in place during this interlude. The revenue continues to flow into federal coffers, the uncertainty continues to hang over the economy, and the political world remains frozen in anticipation. Trump will continue to rage on social media, framing the case as a battle between patriotic nationalism and globalist betrayal. The states will continue to argue that the Constitution still matters, that the separation of powers is not an optional guideline but the foundational structure of American governance. and the justices, alone in their deliberations, will have to decide what kind of country this is going to be. The historical echoes are impossible to ignore. The founders wrote the Constitution in the shadow of a monarchy they had just overthrown. They understood, with a clarity born of direct experience, that concentrated power is the eternal enemy of freedom. They built a system of checks and balances not because they trusted future presidents to exercise restraint, but because they knew that power, by its nature, expands until it meets resistance. The question now is whether that resistance will hold, whether a Supreme Court in an era of extreme polarization and institutional distrust will enforce the limits the founders inscribed, whether the presidency will be restrained or unleashed. The answer, when it comes, will not just affect Donald Trump. It will affect every American who lives under the government these decisions shape. And for all the drama of the courtroom confrontation, all the rage and the theatrics and the social media meltdowns, that is the only thing that truly matters.